Welcome to Asset Management for Local Agencies, Part 2. I'll be your instructor for the workshop. My name is Todd Morrison, and this is brought to you by the South Carolina LTAP. This is Part 2. In Part 1, we talked about the key principles of asset management. We also talked about what happens if you don't use asset management, and we gave you some methods and some tools that would support and encourage the use of asset management. And if you haven't watched that particular webinar yet, I encourage you to go back and check that one out. In part 2, we're going to talk about how to evaluate your asset management practices using 5 core questions that every agency should be able to answer about any of their assets. We're going to talk about building a simple asset inventory to gather information on those assets, and how to be cost effective utilizing condition information about your assets. And finally, we're going to wrap up by identifying requirements for implementing asset management in your agency. First, the 5 core questions that every agency should be able to address. And as I'm going over these, I want you to be thinking about the assets that you manage. Asset is something that has a lot of value that your agency is responsible for taking care of, maintaining. Think about your roadway network, the culverts, maybe the sidewalk ramps, the curb and gutter, the curb box inlets, the signage, guardrail, the fleet of equipment, the buildings that you own. All of these could be assets. And about each and every one of those, we really need to be able to answer, what is the current state of our assets? In other words, what do I have? Where is it located? And then what kind of condition or shape is it in? And that condition or shape is also going to let me know how much life is left in it. And based on that, I can calculate a economic value that is left or remaining. Is that pavement going to last me another 5 years, another 10, given typical traffic and weather? And these are all things that we need to know about each asset. That particular sign that I have installed, how much longer is it going to be good? When is it going to fall below those minimum levels of retroreflectivity? The next question is, what is the required level of service? Now, let's take our roadway network, for example. I could rate my roads on a scale of 1 to 10 if I were looking at it in a simple fashion. So the individuals that I report to, my stakeholders, the individuals who have a stake or a share in this roadway and my roadway network, what do they expect? On a scale of 1 to 10, do they expect the roads to be 7, 6? Does it vary based on the type of road? Is there a difference between primary and secondary roads? Or is there a difference between the paved road network and the gravel road network? And then their level of expectation, let's say they expect the paved roads to be at least a ranking of 7 out of 10. How's that different from what's actually out there? In other words, how far away am I from what these stakeholders expect? The next question is, which assets are critical to sustain performance? And here we're looking at risk. We're trying to figure out which one of these is going to deteriorate first. And when it does deteriorate, if I don't get to it in time with my limited maintenance budget and it fails, what are going to be the consequences of that failure? In order to be able to answer that, we have to, again, assess risk, but we also have to know, how do these roads, culverts, signs, any of our assets, how do they deteriorate? What does that curve look like? How long are they going to stay in good condition? When are they going to fall to fair? And when are they going to drop down into poor? Another question to address is, what are the feasible strategies to consider? So let's take the paved road network. Am I going to look at preventative maintenance options? Am I going to look at chip seal? Am I going to look at slurry seals? Am I going to look at microsurfacing? Am I going to do thin layover or thin overlays? Or is it all just going to be worst first structural repair? And how's that going to play into my capital improvement plan? And the level that I spend on capital improvement versus maintenance, what kind of impact does that have on how the system's doing? Is that going to get me in a better position or a worse position with my overall roadway network in 5 years? And these are questions that we really need to be able to answer. The last one is, how do we pick which long-term funding strategy? Well, we got to know what the goals are, and we need to try to align the best we can, given our budgets, with those goals. Now, as I read through those, if you're thinking, I know a little bit about the road network, but I don't know if I could answer all the questions about the roadway network, or if you're thinking, I know a little bit about the signs, but I don't know where all the signs are, or culverts. Maybe you don't have a culvert inventory. Maybe you can't answer all those questions. Well, these are things that you need to be beginning to think about and plan. How am I going to gather that information? That's critical to asset management and making good business and engineering decisions. So let's take these questions one at a time. The first one is, what is the current state of our assets? Now, in this question, we can break that further down into saying, what do we own? Where is it? What kind of condition is it in? And then how much service life is remaining in that particular asset? And again, I talked about assets. And so when I talked about the assets, I mentioned a few of them, but I want to make sure that we have that. It could be your roads, your bridges, your signs, your culverts, your guardrail, traffic control signals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anything that you own that has value. What do you start with if you're just beginning? I recommend you start with your roads because they have the greatest value, followed by your bridges because if they fail, that's the most or the highest consequence when those bridges fail. But start somewhere, and maybe you already have your roads and your bridges. Well, let's then move on to signs and culverts, all the other assets that we own. The first thing you have to do is figure out, what do I have? All right. And sometimes we know that right away. I've worked with different agencies over the years, and most of them had a really good inventory of their roadways. They knew exactly where they were located. They had them located with GIS maps. But I have worked with some cities and counties that had no clue. They knew they owned roughly 140 miles worth of roadway, and that was it. They had no idea how much was gravel, how much was dirt, or how much was blacktop. So we got to figure that out. And I used to work for the DOT, and I can tell you that with us, that was also a problem. And I'm talking about 15 years ago. I remember I was given the signs. It moved from traffic to maintenance. We were given all the signs. And in our particular highway district, I had no idea where the signs were, how many we owned, what kind of condition they were. I really had no clue. And one of the first things I had to do was to get an inventory and figure out, where are these signs located. Turned out we had thousands. Man, if you haven't done a sign inventory for your city or county, I think you're going to be surprised when you do so as to how many signs you actually own and have installed. You got to figure out, where is it? And again, this could be located with GIS, it could be GPS coordinates, it could simply be a mile point and offset. But you got to be thinking about that. The next one is, what condition is it in? So now you have to think about, how am I going to rate or measure condition? And that's going to vary by asset. I'll give you a couple of examples in just a few minutes on how you might rate roads. Well, let's take culverts. Are you going to rate the culverts by whether they're blocked or not? And is that enough information, or do you need to know whether they're a third blocked, half blocked, or all the way blocked? Do you also need to know what condition that culvert's in? If it's concrete pipe, are those separated? If it's a metal pipe, is that rusted out in the bottom? And so we have to figure out how are we going to rate or measure that condition for the particular asset. And then we have to figure out exactly what is the remaining useful life. And it doesn't have to be exact. It can be an estimate, but how much longer is this going to last? And that is really useful in forecasting economic um, economic realities for our system based upon different levels of funding. And we can predict what the loss to our system is going to be uh, based upon underfunding some of these categories. And that brings me to the last one, which is what is its remaining economic value? And we can see that drop uh, year after year after year. And that can help us make some of those funding decisions as well. All right, so we got to figure out, what do we own? Where is it located? What condition is it in? To do that, if you're going to send a crew out to gather that information, one of the first things they're going to ask you, and this is what my crew for the signs did, they said, what do you want to know about the signs, Todd? Tell us. So that's one thing you got to figure out is, what do you collect? And my advice to you, and the advice of the Federal Highway Administration when we talk about asset management, is start simply. Only gather the data that you need to make decisions. And here we're talking about network level decisions, not project level. In other words, I don't need nearly as much information at this level, the network level, as I do at the project level. I'll give you the example of a paved roadway. I can use a visual assessment, something like the PACER method, for that paved roadway to rank it visually with a windshield, drive down the road from 1 to 10, and that might be good enough at the network level. But if I'm going to actually fund a project on that road, then I need project level decisions or project level information. I need to know how many base failures are on that roadway. I need to know the existing level of rutting or cracking. And I'm going to be taking a lot of measurements. I'm going to be gathering a lot of data. But at the network level, you don't need that much. So start simple. It's easier to start simple, add to it as you go along. Another hint is to use whatever is already out there. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. So check with other divisions within your city, within your county. Check your own records. You may have already gathered a lot of this information. Check with the DOT. They may also have gathered a lot of this information. And as long as you think it's reliable, hey, go ahead and use it. It keeps you from having to gather it all again. And we want to be conscious about the labor cost to gather this information. So try to figure out how you're going to gather it, and gather it as quickly and efficiently as you can. And I've already talked about how much detail is needed. Again, that depends upon whether it's a project or a network level decision that you're making. So let me show you an example. This would be for signs. And let's take this particular sign. How are you going to identify where this sign is? Well, you could use GPS coordinates. That'd be one way. 15 years ago, we used mile points and offsets. We had distance measuring instruments in the vehicle, and I would have it on Kentucky 87 at the 10.875, 10 foot uh, off of the shoulder of the road, perhaps. Might be the example of how I would put where this sign is. You also want to gather some characteristics about the sign, maybe how big it is, the type of sign, the number from the MUTCD on what sign that is. You could also put condition information. So is the sign in good shape? Is it bent? In our case, has it been shot up? If you have a retroreflectometer, You could also check the retroreflectivity of the sign, or maybe if it's a nighttime inspection, you could determine whether it's meeting those minimum levels of retroreflectivity. And then think about what else would you want to know? What else would be important? Maybe it's important to know that this is on a crash-worthy post. You could write down the type of post that it's on, and you could determine, yes, this is crash-worthy. No, it's not. So a lot of ways we can gather that. We can gather it manually with data collectors, iPads, or just a visual assessment. There are methods for that out there. Or if you got a lot of money, they have vans, rideability vans, and video log vans that can collect this information. But again, the automated data collection, expensive. So let me show you an example of how you might think about this and lay this out. This is looking at what do we need to gather for our roadway network, for your city streets, for your county roads. Maybe in column 1, you would write down what are the data needs. You need to know a list of the roads, the names, how long they are, how wide they are, construction dates, the roadway condition, rating of 1 to 10 perhaps, or 0 to 100. Decide, do you want to know the average daily traffic? And of course, I think you want to know the surface type. Is it paved, gravel, dirt roads, unpaved roads? And then we have other columns here where you could think about, is any of this already available? And am I going to collect it for both the primary and the secondary roads? Or if you're with the county, maybe you're thinking, am I going to do this for both the paved roads and the unpaved ones? Or do I have different things that I want to gather based upon the type of road it is, the surface type? And then in column 5, you're going to write down, how are we going to get this? How are we going to gather this information? And this is the beginning of data collection, um, gathering the inventory of what you own, figuring out where it's located, and what condition it's in. That helps answer question 1. Now, I talked about pavement and simple ways that you could do that. With that, it also works the same for unpaved roads. The method that I've seen a lot of individuals use, a lot of states, is one called the PACER method. This comes from the PACER method for unpaved roads, and it just has a simple 1 to 5 rating system here. And that might be good enough for making those network level decisions. If you wanted to go to your favorite search engine, search for the PACER method, you can find these booklets and download them as a PDF. This one is for paved surfaces. And here we rate them from 1 to 10. 10 being perfect, 1 being a road that is completely and totally failed. And again, network level, this might be good enough. But if you have some more time, you have some more money, then you might do something like a pavement condition index, where you're going to go out and you're going to measure the amount of block cracking. You're going to measure the distresses that are in the pavement. A lot more time consuming, but you get a lot more information on your network. But you've got to decide based upon the funding you have, the information that you need, what level you're going to seek. All right, question 2 is, what is the required level of service? In other words, what's my target? Let's say I use the PACER scale. Do my stakeholders want that to be an average rating of 7 for the whole system? What is it? And then once you figure out what your target is, then you can actually take the existing conditions and see how far you are from that. And that helps you figure out how much money would it take to actually get to where the public or the county board or the city commissioners or the city council expect us to be. And as you begin working through this, the first thing you have to do is figure out, who are my stakeholders? And again, that might be the county officials, the city officials, it's definitely the public. There also might be special interest groups, that are concerned. There might be economic boards that are concerned about the transportation network. So you got to write down who are they, and then what are their concerns, because that's not always the same. The city officials, the county officials, they have a goal, and that might be different than the economic board and what they want. So how do you determine that level of service needed? Well, you ask them. You ask them what they expect. You can give them information to help them make an informed decision based upon your budgets, but you ask. And usually, the one that takes the highest priority is the one that is actually writing your paycheck. So that'd be the city officials or your county officials, your bosses, those people that you report to. That's who's going to set that target, but it should be set with input from all the stakeholders. Let me give you some sample targets here. And really, what we're looking at are performance measures and performance targets. So the performance measure would be the condition of the roadway. And this is Grand Rapids, Michigan. Their performance measure was the condition of the roadway. Here it looks like they're using a pavement condition index, a rating of 0 to 100. Their target is to have an average condition greater than 70. All right, once we know that, then we can figure out what our average condition of our network is, compare that, and we can also use our construction data to figure out how much funding would it take to get there. And if we plug in the deterioration of our network, we can also calculate how much funding do we need each year to get to that point, and how long is it going to take us to get there. You can see others that are using PACER. Roscommon County, Michigan, they have 90% of the network with PACER rating greater than 5, 70% of the primary and local roads greater than 6, network average rating greater than 6. So they have a lot of different goals that they have set there, or targets that they want to meet. Calhoun County, a little bit simpler. They just want to make sure that every gravel road is brined to cut down on dust, uphold the fines together, full length, twice each year. And you get to set your own. You set those based upon the existing condition of your network, the funding that could possibly be there for that, and also taking into account your rate of deterioration. You want to set realistic goals. Here's an example, just showing one agency that had a couple hundred miles of roadway, and they figured out what condition their roadways were in currently, and they rated them. Because the city officials, county officials, you only have a limited block of their time. Rather than going 1 through 10, they just put them as fair, better, fair, poor, and good. All right, good being best, poor being the worst. So you had roads that were good condition, maybe that's 7 to 10 on the PACER scale. You have roads that are in fair condition, maybe that's 4 to 6 or 3 to 6 on the PACER scale. And then those that are in poor condition, maybe 1 to 3 on the PACER scale. And they just compressed that down, made it a little bit easier for them to choose from. And then they were able to calculate, based on our existing condition, if you guys want to get all of our roads to good condition, that's going to take over $16 million. If you want to get all the roads to fair or better, that's going to take $6 million. 90% of the paved road network in fair or better condition, then that's going to take $5.25 million to do so. And again, this is just a way that you can give your officials, the ones that you report to, options. That's the engineering side of it. We come up with all these different options. Then we're going to try to make the best business case or the best business decision to get our network to where we want it to be. So what else do you need to know? Well, let's look at questions 3, 4, and 5. All right, question 3 talked about which assets are critical to sustain performance. So we got to take into account risk. We want to know what happens when these assets fail, when the roadways, when the guardrail, when the bridges fail, all right? How do they fail? How long is it going to take? How much useful life is left in this bridge, in this roadway? Where are we at on that deterioration curve? We also want to answer question 4, and that is, what strategies should we be looking at? And here we're talking about preventative maintenance versus capital improvements. And on the preventative maintenance side, which ones can we actually use? Which ones can we do ourselves? Which ones could we find contractors locally to do? Which ones have the best price and are going to last the longest? We could figure an equivalent annual cost based upon maybe the chip seal is going to give my road 5 more years worth of life, and it's going to cost $50,000. That means for $10,000 per year, I can increase the life of that road. But perhaps something else would be cheaper, but maybe not last nearly as long. And I could look at equivalent annual cost here and figure out which strategy do I want to use. And the last one is, how does that strategy line up with what my stakeholders have told me we need to be doing? You got to make sure that those are in alignment as well. So let's look at those. Which assets are critical to sustained performance? That's the first one. Here we want to look at risk. And when we look at risk, we want to check out what are the consequences of failure versus the likelihood of it happening. How likely is this to occur? And what's going to happen when it does? If it has a high chance of happening and the consequences are pretty severe, then that's a high priority item. If it's probably not going to happen and it doesn't really matter if it does happen, then that is a low priority. And that can help us make funding decisions. Give you a couple of examples. Here we have a culvert, and to me, this culvert's already failed. The road hasn't completely failed yet. The culvert has, but not the road. And so when this does go, when the road does completely go, there's going to be a lot of traffic disruptions, depending upon what the other alternate detour routes are. It's going to be an expensive repair. To me, this has a very high likelihood of occurrence of the road failing because the culvert's already gone. And depending upon the detour routes, how long they are, what else is available, that's either going to be a low consequence or a high consequence. I'm probably going to call it a high consequence. This would be a high priority for me. Now here's a bridge that is beginning to fail. And this has a extremely high consequence if it does fail. And lack of maintenance on it means it's likely to occur. So this is going to be another one that is a moderate to a high priority. And here we have a road with a base failure in it. We can already see some mud pumping up through it. Likelihood of failure, yeah, it's pretty close to being failed now. So it's not pumping really bad yet, though. But still, high likelihood of failure. But what are the consequences? Well, it depends on what the average daily traffic is on that roadway. Not a lot of traffic, it might be a low consequence. So to me, this is low to moderate priority, especially if I have failed culverts and failed, for sure, bridges that are close to being failure or structurally deficient. The fourth question is, what are the feasible strategies to consider? Right, so which ones could you do yourself? Which ones can you have contractors locally that might be able to do? And then you have to look at, how does this impact your overall condition of your network? And the fifth question is, the strategy that you pick, does that align with the goals set by your city council, by your county officials? So a lot of times what we'll do is look at trade-off improvements based upon different funding levels. And these are charts that could be generated by pavement management programs, bridge management programs. They could also be generated by really simple spreadsheets. But in this particular chart, what we're looking at is the percentage of assets in good condition over a period of time. And we have three different funding levels. The bottom level is do nothing. And oftentimes we can put that in there and we can see the economic loss each year if we didn't do anything to our network. And as you can see, if we do nothing, we're going to go from a condition of 60, that's a bottom blue line, a starting condition of 60 in 10 years, it's going to be completely failed. It's going to be down to 0 as far as a condition rating. Let's take funding level 1, and maybe that's our current funding level. We plug that in, funding level 1, and we can see that based upon the deterioration curve that we've calculated, the current condition of the network, funding level 1 is going to allow us to maintain our current condition of just a little bit above 60. But let's say that our city council said, you know what, we want our average condition, or sorry, the percentage of our assets to be in good condition to go up. And so you plug in a different funding level 2, that's a higher funding level, and you can show that you're up about 95% at the end of 10 years with this particular funding level. And then you can present those options to them. You can also take these three endpoints, plot those out, and then really you can show them based upon any funding level what condition the roadway network would be. You can extrapolate that out, show them what condition it would be with a funding level between 1 and 2, or if they were to cut the budget. You know, if they cut the budget, how much would they cut the budget before it would drop the roadway network to 50% of the assets in good condition? And again, that's the value of these trade-off analyses. Not only looking at funding levels, you can also analyze and calculate different funding strategies. One of the strategies we talked about in asset management part 1 is the worst first, meaning that whatever funding I get for preventive maintenance and capital improvements, I take every bit of that and I go to the roads that have completely failed in my network and I try to fix those. And if I use a worst first strategy, what's going to happen with my network? We can plug that in, look at 3 years down the road, and as you can see, that's the top chart. All of the roads get in worse shape. We can also look at a mix of fixes. A mix of fixes meant that we were going to do a certain percentage of preventative maintenance. Maybe 30% of our funding was going to preventative maintenance, 70% was going to go to capital improvements. Well, how's that going to impact the network? Where am I going to be? And you can look at different percentages of preventative maintenance versus capital improvements and give those decision makers different options. And again, this is the engineering side that is helping make good business decisions, good informed business decisions. All right, so those are the 5 questions that every agency should be able to answer about any of their assets. And they were, what is the current state of our assets? What is the required level of service? Which assets are critical to sustain performance? What are the feasible strategies to consider? And which long-term funding strategy should be selected? And the way that I would implement this is with a 10-step process. This helps answer the first question, which is what is the condition of my assets? So I'd first get that asset inventory together. I would then look at the condition of whatever asset I was inventorying, guardrail, roads, bridges, culverts, sidewalk ramps, signs, buses, dump trucks, buildings, etc., whatever it might be. We would also figure out how do they fail? You know, what is that deterioration curve? How much life is left in all of those different assets? And we can also then look at replacement costs, but that helps answer the first question. The next thing I would do is determine what are my target levels, my performance targets. So we have the performance measure. For example, we can use the PACER system to say we want all of our roads to be in good or better shape, or maybe you want 70% of our roads to be in good or better shape. Um, or you could look at signage and say that your goal would be, your performance target would be that all signs would be meeting the minimum retroreflectivity requirements. Um, or you could have gravel roads, and maybe you're going to say, like Calhoun County did, that you're going to brine those twice per year. Maybe your performance target is to grade and stabilize those twice per year. But we're going to set those again based upon the condition of our roadway and the expectations of our stakeholders, and then considering the funding levels. We'll also look at risk. This was a game that, not a game, but something that I always had to do. I would be given X amount of dollars for my labor, equipment, and materials for our highway district. And then I'd have to decide, what are we going to work on? Am I going to spend this much money on pothole repair? How much am I going to spend on vegetation removal? How much am I going to spend on replacing cross drains? How much am I going to spend on bridge maintenance? And risk went into that. Condition of the asset, risk, and then what were the expectation levels and how far away was I from it? And that allows you to really optimize your capital investment, your operations and your maintenance investment. And again, you're trying to figure out what is that sweet spot that works for us with preventative maintenance and capital improvements. Now, if you just look at the numbers, preventative maintenance is the way to go. That's the way to get your network in the best shape possible. But we also have people that we deal with. We have the public. They're one of the stakeholders. And at some point, they expect us to get to that failed road or that failed structure. So we have to figure out what balance are we going to strike between those two. And with that, we're going to set our funding strategy. We're going to make sure that it aligns with the goals that have been set by our city or by our county. And then we're going to build an asset management plan. Now, the plan is critical because it says, here's what we have, here's what condition it's in, uh, here is how much money we have to spend that's been allocated, and here's how we're going to spend it. And this is what we expect the impact of the network to be based upon our analysis. And then critical to it is that asset management plan becomes a living document. You don't just do it once and forget about it. Each year, you look at that again. You review it. Did I correctly determine how my roads deteriorate? Did I figure that out? And you assess them. You look at the condition again. Maybe you don't have the manpower to do that. Perhaps it's every 2 years that you come back and redo your asset management plan to make it match current conditions and what's happened. Or with South Carolina, maybe you had a hurricane come through and all of a sudden, man, things happen in your network that you didn't anticipate. And so you've got to reset and figure out, how am I going to handle this? And that's really the goal, because irregardless of how much money you have, I mean, we all have limited funding. It all has a limit to it, and we're all trying to do the best we can with the money given to us. If you don't have a plan, you're not doing the best you can. You got to have a plan. You got to figure out, how am I going to spend this and why? And that's why I love this process, because it logically gives you reasons why you're spending the money in the areas that you are. It's also transparent. You've got it written down. The city officials, the county officials, they agree with you. You're trying to hit their performance targets, and they've made funding decisions based upon what they've told you. So I love this process. If the public has questions, you can show them exactly why you're doing what you're doing. There are a lot of tools out there. If you will take your favorite search engine and type in asset management, Federal Highway Administration, you're going to find a ton of tools that could help you. But what I want to encourage you to do is I don't want you to be overwhelmed. If you are just starting on the path of asset management, if you've just listened to this webinar and you're like, man, this is the first time I'm hearing this, but it sounds like way too much work. I can't be doing this. I'm busy. I understand. Uh, my response to you would be, hey, it's okay. You don't build this all at once. You don't get all this together at one time or in 1 year. You just start where you are, start gathering data, start answering that question number one, what do we own? And add pieces to it as you go along, as you have time. Begin to move away from worst first to an asset management approach. And that philosophy is going to put you in much better shape 5 years from now. It's going to put your network in much better shape 5 years from now. Even if you don't have it all in place, even if you don't have it all figured out, just take the first step and start moving that direction. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Today we talked about how to evaluate your asset management using those 5 core questions. We talked about building an asset inventory, assessing asset condition, which is critical as well. And then we also talked about how do you put this in place in your agency. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you at future workshops.